I'm here to talk about health. Your health, my health, the health of your families and friends, especially our children. I'm actually here to talk about health, in fact, of our country. But talking about health, thinking about how we can get health, we are in a system today that is not exactly to our liking. I think many of you would probably agree that we have a healthcare crisis. 18% of our gross domestic product is accounted for by the money we spend for taking care of our health. In this country, the United States has the highest per capita healthcare costs in the world. We're twice as high as the next highest country. But in spite of all this money that's being spent, the quality of our health care, we've got to really face it. The quality of our health care in this country, according to the statistics and health indicators, we place us near last among similarly economically developed countries. On top of it, we've got another problem too. We've got more than 50 million people who don't have health insurance. And that's up 40% just in the last decade. This is a fantastic business model, I think you would agree. It really has been. A lot of people are making a lot of money. But as far as health, it's not a good health model. In terms of looking to the future of what's likely to come because of this problem we presently have, if the tripling of childhood obesity during the last decade, or the last 30 years, is any indication, we're not going in the right direction. Especially when we think about, too, the invasion of our children by type 2 diabetes. It used to be called adult onset diabetes. We might as well put the children thing in it, too. Or the 83% increase in a harsh drug like Ritalin in our children during the last 4 years. Something's not quite right. I'm talking about prescription drugs, by the way. At the present time, 9 out of 10 people 60 years of age and older are consuming at least one or more prescription drugs on a regular basis. I'm not one of them, by the way, and I'm more than 60. Neither is my wife taking drugs. Prescription drugs costs, on the other hand, have doubled in the last decade, and that's after we take into consideration adjustment for inflation. And on this particular point, as much as we are using prescription drugs these days, it's sort of the centerpiece of our healthcare system, it turns out it's the number 3 cause of death. Some would say number 4, depending on how you divide up the first 3. But in any case, you don't see this listed in the causes of death in most of the popular reports. Something's missing. Something is missing from our system, and that's really what I want to talk to you about. I'd like to suggest it's nutrition. We don't understand it. It's confusing. And on this question concerning nutrition, let me just do a little defining here, if I may. Nutrition, if we think of it biologically, is actually using food to maintain health and prevent disease. And the typical diet that we now, in my view, believe is the healthiest possible diet is the so-called 80-10-10 diet. Namely, it's the nutrient composition having to do with 80 parts carbohydrate, 10 parts protein, 10 parts fat on the basis of an energy basis. And that translates into a practical message. What I'm talking about now, it's a whole food, plant-based diet with little or no of the 3 devils. Oil and fat being one, sugar and salt. That's the diet that really does create optimum health. And on that question concerning nutrient composition, by the way, nutrient composition is the index. It's the characteristic of food that best defines its effect on us in terms of health. And in terms of this nutrient composition question, antioxidants, complex carbohydrates, and vitamins those are the key elements that really give rise to health. They're all found in plants. That's what plants really are. Plants make these things. Animal foods don't make these things. We might see little antioxidants in animals from animal-based foods from time to time, but that has to do with the animals having eaten that kind of thing before they were slaughtered. Fat and protein are essential elements, absolutely essential elements. But it turns out that plants have around 9–11% or so of their on average. Animal-based foods have quite a bit more. So there's the distinctive difference between animal and plant-based foods. There's another class of foods that's crept into our society too in more recent decades that has to do with processed foods. Processed foods, their nutrient composition is all over the map. It depends on how one combines pieces of the other groups of foods. Processed foods also are not good because they tend to be very high in salt, sugar, and fat, the three devils. So I come back to my main point is whole plant-based foods that really are doing the job for us. Now, when people think about whole plant-based foods, we've known for a good long time, our grandmothers told us, our mothers told us that it prevents future disease. But it's not only about using this diet to prevent future disease, and here is the kicker. Here is the thing that really matters that the public tend not to know. It's also about using this same kind of diet to actually treat existing disease. And I think this is a really important concept because it goes right to the core of what our healthcare and medical care system is all about. Here's a list of diseases, for example, that one can find in the legitimate scientific literature, in the peer-reviewed literature. Here are diseases that have been documented to be affected by a whole food plant-based diet. That is to say, this kind of diet prevents, suspends, that means stops the further progression, or cures all of these diseases. We can now cure heart disease in fairly late stages. We can cure type 2 diabetes in a very short period of time. I have spent more than 50 years in this field as an experimental researcher, if you will, in the area of nutrition. And I want to share with you a little bit about where I came from and why I think the way I do now. It's controversial for some, but nonetheless, I really believe in the data that we've obtained. Initially, I was involved in investigating nutrients on a one-by-one basis, and still today, that's the way research tends to work. Looking at one thing at a time, just one thing at a time. But over the years, I finally came to the view, and this is really where the punchline is here, this is where the power of nutrition really exists. Nutrition should be recognized as a holistic effect of countless nutrients involving countless diseases, working through countless mechanisms. Now I want to share with you just some, as I look back and sort of ask myself, how did I sort of get to this place? Because I didn't start here in my career some 50 years ago. And I want to share with you just a few observations that were taken from my own research, quite a number of years ago now, 30, 35 years ago, that kind of set the stage in a way for developing some principles that apply to what nutrition and health really is all about. This model I'm going to be telling you about in the next 3 or 4 slides here involves a laboratory animal model, laboratory rats in this particular case, that have been genetically programmed to get cancer. And so let's see what do we see. I'm interested in this particular case here to see what effect nutrition might have on that model, where the genes are there to create the disease. When we feed, in this particular case, an animal that has the ideal levels of protein, that being about 20% of total protein, when we feed a diet that is 20% diet of protein, these cancers are growing well in the first 6 weeks in those animals. In contrast, when you feed a diet of 5% diet of protein, they don't, even though they've been genetically programmed to get the disease. This next little bit of this next observation really struck me as being quite significant. Namely, when we watch these sort of cancers growing in the first stage and switch the diet back and forth between 20% protein and 5% protein, you can see it there. We could get to a point where we could turn on and turn off cancer development, which is a very exciting concept. Because it basically says, in this case it's protein, but basically in a more general sense, it shows that nutrition controls cancer development. Very exciting concept. Instead of thinking about genes causing cancer or carcinogens causing cancer or viruses causing cancer, well, I'm talking about here in this particular case, nutrients, nutrition, basically controlling cancer development. Now, it turns out that the protein that we were using up until a certain point in time, didn't pay a lot of attention to it because it was a protein that was available for us, was casein. Casein is the main protein in cow's milk. Why is that important? Well, soy and wheat protein, for example, does not increase cancer development like does casein. Here's a couple of plant proteins not doing it, one animal protein doing it. A major difference between the two. So it suggested at that particular point in time the hypothesis that maybe animal protein would promote cancer and plant protein would prevent cancer. And that came down as a fairly general statement that I was to carry through much of my research. It turned out that's the bifurcation that really led to this distinctive differences between these two different kinds of foods. Now, as I say, this is a little troubling for me personally at the time because actually I was raised on a dairy farm. There's me up front, maybe I think it's about 9.5 years ago or so. And another just sort of sidebar story here before I go on. I talked about casein, dairy, and so forth. And so we have a lot of evidence now that dairy is a troublesome food, a very troublesome food, not just because of what we found with respect to its ability to increase cancer, but my family, we don't use dairy anymore, haven't in some time. And I suggest if we want to do it right, get with the program. So let's go back then to the model that I was using just to tell you about some of the principles that in fact affected me and my thinking in a larger context as we went forward. Namely, in this particular case, we're looking at just not that 5%, 20% kind of thing, but we're looking at a range of protein concentrations in the food to see what happens. And you can see here that in the lower levels of protein, dietary protein from 4 to 10% in this particular case, it's not the exact amounts I'm really concerned about here, it's the inflection that I want to talk about. But with up to about 10% dietary protein, what you can see is that protein is doing its good thing. It's not creating cancer. It's not promoting cancer. Protein is an essential nutrient. We need it. Everything's working fine. So what I'm talking about here is when we consume it in excess of the amount we need. And in fact, most of us humans actually live in that red zone where we're consuming in excess of what we need. So that 10% is enough, really is enough. And that actually is provided by a diet made up of whole plant-based foods. If we're consuming a diet of whole plant-based foods, we're actually getting the ideal levels of protein. We don't need more. But unfortunately, 95% of us, according to the national statistics, are consuming in excess of what we need, and we do that by actually consuming animal-based foods. Now I want to just take you to just another little idea here coming from these experiments that I found very interesting. Just a little schematic, so just treat it as a schematic. I've just sort of given you two clusters of cells. One cluster, the red cells, those are the ones, let's argue, let's propose, they're the genetically programmed cells that give rise to cancer. The seed has been planted. The immunogenic event has occurred. Okay, those are the cells that are programmed to get cancer. The blue cells are the normal cells. So on the left, we've got a high dose, let's say a high dose of genetically prone cancer cells. On the right, we've got a far less dose, just a little bit. Now, if all else is considered equal, if nothing else has changed beyond that point, obviously the one with the highest dose of the genetically programmed cancers are going to get more cancer. Fair enough. The ones on the right get less cancer. So in that particular case, it's legitimate to say that genes cause cancer. All diseases really start with genes at some fundamental level. So in this case, we can say genes cause cancer. Sort of makes sense. However, look what happens when we get to that stage. And now, our genes are constant over a lifetime, more or less. But we go beyond the genes. If we look in this particular model here, it turns out that if you take the cells on the left, where there's a very high degree of genetic concentration of the cells, feed them the low protein diets, we get less cancer, not more. In other words, completely just switch it. So what really matters here is not the genes. What's mattering in this particular case is the expression of those genes. That, in turn, is controlled by nutrition. And that is really one of the most fundamental properties of nutrition across the board, not just in this particular model, but in this particular model, it was actually a key. It was a key. It was a lead-in, in fact, to a larger consideration. So nutrition controls cancer genes. It controls genes across the board. It's really quite interesting for all kinds of diseases. And so we can say nutrition trumps genes. That's my view, and we have lots of evidence now to really make that point. It's something we can do about rather than something we can't do anything about. And it turns out there's a list of these same diseases, again, that all basically start with genes controlled by nutrition. So I have a question in the current conversation we're having now. If nutrition controls genes, then why are we spending so much money for genetic research? In my estimations, a rough approximation, we're spending at least 100 times the amount of funding for genetic research than we do for nutrition research. When in fact it's nutrition that actually gives us the health. It's not the genes. Genetic research, of course, makes money. Or at least there's the perception of those who are making this money available that in fact it's doing that. Nutrition research only makes health. So it comes down to this. How do we understand nutrition? As I said in the beginning, it's about looking at one nutrient at a time. And we see that every day. The recommended dietary allowances, this nutrient, you need this much, food labeling. It's actually led to a vitamin supplement industry, as a matter of fact. A $30+ billion industry. We now know that nutrient supplements really don't do the job. That's not what we need. I like to say, let's call that an old paradigm. The practice of medicine was the same sort of argument. At the present time, our health system, our medical practice system is reductionist in nature. We think about single causes, single biomarkers. You go to the doctor, he tells you how much cholesterol you have, how much blood sugar, as if these are really things that count and all by themselves. Or single diseases, that's how we give them this international classification of disease code. Doctors get paid according to what they diagnose. By our thinking of health in terms of one thing at a time, in a narrow little context like that, what it means is, okay, well, now we're going to find one thing to cure things. We make drugs with all their side effects. That becomes the primary means of health maintenance. So I'm going to suggest we're at the threshold now. We can be at the threshold now of actually transforming the entire healthcare system and think of it a different way. Think about what we can do, and that's really about nutrition. There's countless, as I said. We have to think about nutrition. This is a real challenge to the way we do research, the way we think about things. Nutrition is not a one-on-one kind of thing. It's a collective thing. We call it holism, a holistic kind of idea. It's really, quite frankly, is anathema as far as the scientific community is concerned. That's at least my experience. But that's what nutrition is. Many diseases, working as a symphony. And interestingly, this is simple. It's very complex biology, but it's a simple solution. Just decide what we should put in our mouths. A whole food plant, vegetables, fruits, grains, and legumes. Don't add back to oil, fat, and sugar. It's a lot cheaper. It really works. And as far as coming back to my initial thesis is concerned, we now have information, empirical data, to actually show that if you take a group of people, I've been involved in a couple of these tests now. If you take a group of people, give them the right food, the things that happen to us, whether we have a disease or not, are remarkable. You can see these things within a week or two. Cholesterols go down, body weight drops off, and I'm going to say that should be the future of medicine. Or let's say, I don't like the word medicine. Let's say it's the future of food and the future of our health. Thank you.